really wonderful to see so many of you here for the first Medieval Work in Progress seminar of the year. My name is Alex Bovey, and I'm one of the medievalists in the medieval squadron of the Courtauld. And ordinarily, the organizer of this series would be doing the introductions, but it is my very great honor this evening to introduce the speaker, who is the organizer of the series. That is beloved Dr. Tom Nickson, who I will introduce in a moment. Before, a couple of little housekeeping things to draw your attention to. We have another Medieval Work in Progress seminar a little bit later this semester. It was rearranged from earlier this month, which is Niamh Bala, who's speaking about her research on Cappadocia and I think the afterlife. And I actually haven't managed to scroll down to that. Where's the next one? I'm not gonna succeed at this, am I? This is very bad. Oh, there she is, bright pink, and it says essential. Actually, it says booking essential, but it will be essential. So that one is on the 15th of November. So everything is with spectacular ineptitude. I'm really a Mac user, you see. And then after next week is our reading week at the Courtauld, so we don't have much, if anything, organized. But on the 6th of November, we're delighted to have Stefan Kemperdink be joining us as a scholar in residence for the week, courtesy of Professor Susie Nash, who's invited him. And Stefan is just the most remarkable person. Recently curated the Hugo van der Goes exhibition that was recently in Berlin. And he's coming back to do a number of events for us, the most public of which is a lecture on the 6th of November about Arnolfini. I'm not really sure how you're supposed to say that. Arnolfini? Anyway, so, and are there other things that I should mention, Tom, as well?
6th December.
6th of December. It's not yet on our research forum program, but do make a note of a visit by Asaf Pincus, who will be talking on the 6th of December, I think about giants. Which sounds like, I work on giants also, so it sounds like I might be just projecting that onto Asaf, but he's got a book forthcoming from Brill about that topic. So that will be really wonderful too. So now that we're all settled, I shall introduce Tom almost as briefly as he instructed me to. I'm not supposed to tell you about things like his life story or the primary school that he went to or anything like that, so I won't. Tom is reader in medieval art and architecture here at the Courtauld, where he is really a remarkable leader and citizen in lots of different ways. He organizes this seminar. He's the head of our MA in History of Art. And he has just finished a tour of duty as the editor of the Journal of the British Archaeological Association, one of the most important journals, as you'll know, in our field. He also, I think, will be known to many of us as a specialist in the Iberian Peninsula. He published in 2015 a really beautiful, and I think award-winning book, not just from like me and Susie and everyone, but from other people as well, on Toledo Cathedral. And he's working now on a book that will, I think, introduce quite a wide readership to the architecture of Spain and Portugal in the Middle Ages. And he also, the breadth of his interest, probably I'm going too far now in telling you this, but his BA teaching also includes really, really fascinating things like his new course on facsimiles, which goes backwards from AI all the way to Plato through the history of art. So we're very lucky to have him as a colleague, and I think as a speaker tonight, he'll be talking to us on towers, travel, and architectural habits in the Middle Ages. So, Tom, thank you.
Well, thanks, Alex. I should say as well, it sounds amazingly self-serving that I organised a series and then I put myself first. Our speaker who was meant to be doing this session had to at the last minute change, and so I just thought it would be easier to do something myself. But thank you all for coming, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments and questions at the end of this paper, which was really is really based on an essay I wrote following an invitation to contribute to the Routledge Companion to the Global Renaissance. And if I'm honest, I don't really like the idea of global renaissance, and you'll see me kind of struggling with that as I go through this paper. I don't really like the Routledge Companions either. They're very expensive and inaccessible, I think. But I nonetheless took up the invitation to speak about architecture in this context, because I am interested in the way that we think about buildings in relation to this kind of global turn in our history, particularly in a period before the widespread circulation of drawings and prints and so on. How can we ensure that architecture doesn't get left behind as everybody else is studying all these portable mobile objects that are kind of zinging around the globe? So I would say, though, this has given me an opportunity to develop an interest, maybe even an obsession, with climbing towers that I've had the last few years. It's something that came out of, in some ways, out of the material I was looking at for this book that I never seem to be finishing, but it's also been kind of turbocharged in some ways in recent years, because whenever I visit a city with my daughters, the only thing we're allowed to do, we're not allowed to visit churches, but we are allowed to climb towers. I've done a lot of tower climbing in the last few years, and this has really made me think about this problem, or this issue. So, my fundamental question is, what connects the lighthouse of Alexandria, erected in Ptolemaic Egypt in the 3rd century, the minaret of the Almohad Mosque in Seville in Spain, completed in 1198, a 15th century glazed or porcelain pagoda of the Baoan Temple in Nanjing, East China, the tower of the town hall in Brussels, begun in 1449 in what is now Belgium, and the so-called Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan, newly rebuilt in the early 16th century, its partial ruins still visible in the centre of Mexico City. Not chronology, material, type, function, patron, or design. According to the terms of traditional art history, or even architectural history, these buildings are disconnected, static witnesses to the mobile objects, people, and ideas that travel between them. These structures, nonetheless, share two related characteristics. All were of impressive height, and here I'm showing them approximately to scale, but I've given their estimated heights in many cases as well. So all were of impressive height relative to their cityscapes around them, and all were climbed by visitors. Climbing tall buildings for the view is now a common feature of tourist city breaks, as I've hinted at. But in this paper, I will argue that the late 15th and early 16th centuries represented a crucial moment in the growing popularity of what I'm calling an architectural habit among European travellers, some of whom continued that habit and encountered older versions of it when voyaging beyond Latin Christendom. And when I speak of habit here, I follow the conventional definition that you can find in the OED, for example, of, quote, a settled disposition or tendency to act in a certain way, especially one acquired by frequent repetition of the same act until it becomes almost or quite involuntary, but also with an emphasis on the way that this is shaped by society, and thus closer to the notion of habitus, which, it was shown only recently, was first developed by Pierre Bourdieu in the postface to his 1967 translation of Panofsky's Gothic architecture and scholasticism. So this idea of habitus has a nice kind of medieval historiographic origin. To take a conventional medieval example, we might think of the habit developed by a pilgrim on the road to Compostela who learned to head for the space behind the altar when looking for a saint shrine, for example, but we could think of lots of other architectural habits. Consideration of such architectural habits, I suggest, offers an alternative to models of mobility or influence, allowing connections to be drawn between buildings and spaces in terms of how they shape the behaviours of those encountering them. How did travellers to distant lands behave at the threshold of a religious building, for example, or before a fountain, or in a cemetery, square, or garden? How are those actions moulded by everyday or one-off experiences at home or abroad, or by particular literary, artistic, or scientific genres? In this paper, I will consider the evidence for when, how, and why visitors climbed the buildings mentioned at the outset, touching briefly on intersections of art, architecture, cartography, and exploration at that vexed transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern. For Jacob Burckhardt, it was partly Petrarch's propensity to climb high places in search of a view, be that from the top of Mount Vernon or from the baths of Trajan as he surveyed the ruins of ancient Rome, that marked him out as a Renaissance man. For Michel de Certeau, surveying the view from the World Trade Center in New York, enjoying the view from on the Heim was a phenomenon specific to modernity. For we moderns, the view from above is most closely associated with our experience of flying, that ultimate symbol of global global modernity, but also a reminder, for me at least, of the kind of special magic of that view. You know, I'm still someone who ideally would sit at the window seat and gaze over the cities. These views from above have a special power, I think, even today. But in this paper, I want to qualify that association with modernity that comes from Burckhardt and de Certeau and others. And I also wish, by locating this architectural habit in multiple centres, to interrogate the Eurocentrism of that view and explore the social, cultural, and technological circumstances that encourage such behaviours. So, to make this argument, I first need to distinguish between travellers who climbed towers and other more mundane moments when towers were climbed. Watchtowers, belvederes, and other towers are a common feature of architecture from across the world, offering defensive positions or privileged views to those with access to high levels, and serving as landmarks for those below. Yet in medieval Europe, as far as we know, most towers were not designed to be climbed by visitors. Although tourists now often hike up the steep and narrow stairs of medieval church towers, for example, it seems that most such staircases were originally built to provide access for construction or maintenance, and are notably less accessible than the wider, shallower staircases in the same buildings, designed to enable the public or the clergy to reach upper chapels or chambers. And this experience, I hope, is familiar to many of you who've kind of sweated your way up those narrow staircases in churches and other buildings. Certainly many of my students have done that. Many towers in castles, palaces, or domestic residences were likewise closed to all but the most privileged visitors. The extraordinarily tall Asinelli Tower in Bologna, a beacon of the family's status and power, is, for example, best appreciated from afar. And it seems unlikely that the members of the family regularly bothered to climb up its rather treacherous staircase to enjoy the view, unless receiving special guests. Freestanding towers in many Ming or early Chinese imperial cities similarly served principally as landmarks, although their height also meant that the sound of bells or drums could spread from them and through the city without impediments. In an Islamic context, tall minarets topped with loud speakers now offer similar acoustic advantages. But previously the call to prayer was most commonly made from a balcony or opening located only slightly higher than neighbouring structures. Otherwise the wind might carry the sound away. So we think now if you go to any city in the Islamic world and you get woken by the call to prayer from these loudspeakers at the top of minarets, that might be where the call to prayer was always made. But in fact, for a human to make the call to prayer from the top of a tall minaret would be nonsensical. It would be swept away by the wind. You need to be much lower, maybe just above the rooftops. so that the sound can carry over them. The height of minarets, such as we see here, the Giralda in Seville, in its current incarnation, is best understood in relation to their status as symbols of Islam, and has little to do, in fact, with the call to prayer. This is Jonathan Bloom's key argument about minarets. So I'm trying to distinguish here between the kind of practice of people kind of occasionally climbing towers. There are lots of towers all over the place. People who are building those towers, people who are using those towers, yes, occasionally climb them. And I'm trying to distinguish between that practice and that of visitors or travellers who are climbing towers for a rather different purpose as part of this kind of travelling experience, part of the experience of enjoying a view and surveying the city, as we'll see. And that habit, the habit whereby visitors climbed towers, nonetheless has long roots. In 985, the Jerusalem-born geographer Muqaddisi visited the lighthouse in Alexandria, recording that its internal ramp was broad enough for a horseman. And this is the first of several Arabic accounts that imply that visitors to Alexandria were climbing the lighthouse, including those by Abu Hamid al-Gharnati in the early 12th century, al-Idrisi in the 1150s, al-Balawi in the 1160s, Yaqut in the 1220s, and al-Abdari in 1289. These are the earliest known descriptions of travellers climbing towers in Europe or the Mediterranean, and as none of these writers recorded climbing other towers during their extensive travellers, this isolated phenomenon was likely prompted by the extraordinary fame of the lighthouse and its special status as an architectural marvel. So we have, by these and other travellers, lots of accounts of visiting buildings and so on, but the only one that they seem to have climbed was the lighthouse of Alexandria. There seems to have been something special about this building, and I suggest it's to do with its extraordinary height. The minarets of the congregational mosques of Cordoba and Seville were likewise acclaimed as the tallest structures in Al-Andalus, now southern Spain. Cordoba's minaret was built in the 10th century, and its staircase is described in detail in the 1140s by al-Idrisi, who probably climbed it while he was a student in Cordoba. The minaret in Seville, now known as the Giralda, was completed in the 1190s and described soon afterwards by a local scholar, Ibn Sahib al-Salah. And I should just say, what I'm showing you in the middle is the Giralda as it is today, with its 16th century upper levels. It's adapted from the old minaret of the Al-Mahad Mosque, and we have numerous visual testimonies to that, the appearance of that minaret, not least this relief which comes from a 15th century tomb slab, and this combined with various written descriptions of the minaret in the late 12th century allow it to be reconstructed with some confidence, as you see here. So Ibn Sahib tells us that this minaret, the description of which surpasses speech and whose mention comes first for every historian, has no equal among the mosques of Al-Andalus in its lofty elevation, its firm foundations, its solid workmanship, brick construction, rare craftsmanship and splendid appearance. It soared into the air and towered in the sky and could be seen by the naked eye a day's journey from Seville with the stars of Gemini. It was built without stairs, and one ascended it by a passage wide enough for beasts of burden, people and the custodians. And this idea that you can climb these towers, that a horse or beast could climb these towers is a common trope that you see in a lot of these descriptions. So for al-Idrisi and Ibn Sahib, as for Muqaddisi and other visitors to the lighthouse of Alexandria, climbing was a way of affirming the architectural worth of these towers and the cities around them. And this architectural interest distinguishes such descriptions from others which I've discussed elsewhere, in which tall buildings or hilltops were climbed in order to survey cities or landscapes in the context of military conquest, although we'll see that those genres do kind of intersect at various moments. Although watchtowers and belvederes must have been climbed very regularly, it's striking that surviving Latin or Arabic sources from the Middle Ages rarely record travellers climbing towers for the view, even when, as with medieval pilgrims' accounts of Jerusalem, Rome or Mecca, records are very extensive. And evidence for climbing towers surfaces only occasionally. One early example is Bonvicino della Riva's panegyric of 1288 to Milan, Italy, in which he advised that anyone who wished to see and savour the city should, quote, ascend thankfully the tower of the Curia. From there, turning eyes all around, one can marvel at the wonderful sights. And I put in this image of Milan, which isn't actually related to Bonvicino's account necessarily, but we'll see that these circular depictions of cities, and this is a relatively early example, can be related in some cases to views from towers. Francesco Petrarch's 1341 letter describing how he contemplated the view, what he calls the prospectus, of Rome's ruins from the roof of the baths of Diocletian, represents a variant of this behaviour, inspired perhaps by Virgil's description of Aeneas gazing from his roof at Troy, and enthusiastically followed by later humanists. The young men who frequented the tower and dome of Florence Cathedral did so not for the view, but because it was relatively private. But from the 15th century onwards, European travellers' accounts of tower climbing multiply in striking fashion, and not merely in proportion to the greater number of surviving sources. So, we find evidence scattered through the Middle Ages that people are occasionally climbing towers, but I think this really takes off in the 15th century, and I think that that's not only because we have a lot more travellers' accounts from this period as well. A 1434 description of Paris, for example, explained that there were as many steps in the Tower of Notre Dame in Paris as there were days in the year, implying that it could be climbed by visitors. During their visit to Brussels in 1465, the Bohemian noble Leo von Rosmetal and two companions were taken up the tower of the town hall, quote, from which we survey the whole city. The tower is an elegant structure and of great height, one of them recorded, quote, reaching up into the heavens, and together with the council house, it is situated in the heart of the city, end of quote. The novelty of this behaviour is suggested by the fact that despite visiting many other cities across Europe, the trio claimed only one other tower, this time to marvel at an impressive new bell. So why were they taking up the tower in Brussels specifically? Of striking height and appearance, the tower was newly completed when the trio visited, and the design of its unusually elaborate stairs suggests that visitors were anticipated from the outset. So I think there's something about the novelty of this design, the fact that it was very tall, but also built into the design is this very kind of dramatic staircase, which you can see, it might be quite difficult to follow, but how the stairs rise through the lower levels, and then when we get to the spire at the top, you have them situated at the very centre of the star going up, but with this, in this kind of framework, this skeletal framework, which means that they can look out, but also potentially we can see them going up. And I just, as a student at Paul Crosley, I felt kind of obliged to show you this famous staircase up the buttresses of Prague Cathedral, designed by Peter Parler, which is often said to be the kind of model for this idea of a kind of dramatic staircase that dramatizes this idea of ascent. This behavior in Brussels may then be related, I suggest, to a growing civic self-consciousness, evident also in the growing popularity of cityscapes and landscapes in 15th century Flemish painting. So I don't want to kind of suggest a causal link between the two, but I think it's interesting that at this moment, or around about this moment, we also have lots of these aerial views of real or imagined Netherlandish cityscapes. The most prolific tower climber of the late 15th century, however, was the Nuremberg doctor, Hieronymus Munzer, who in 1494, 1495 travelled into Switzerland, southern France, Spain and Portugal, returning to Germany via northern France and Flanders. When he reached Barcelona on the 21st of September 1494, his first major city stop in Spain, he recorded in his itinerarium for the first time that he had climbed the cathedral tower, quote, "From the tower which I diligently surveyed the setting and the city. What a marvellous sight. I believe the city is twice as big as Nuremberg." And you can see that quote at the top here. Elsewhere, when describing towers, Munzer uses the word turris, the kind of standard Latin term. But Munzer's vocabulary here suggests he was encouraged by a long-standing literary tradition of imaginatively surveying the world from a tower, or ex specula. So this is the only time when he talks about it from seeing it from a specula, from this kind of watchtower, which can be connected to this very long-standing kind of literary, imagined tradition of surveying the world. Clearly inspired by this experience, Munzer went on to climb another 26 towers on his journey, including those in newly conquered Granada, where he also marvelled at the many mosques, in Seville, where he met indigenous people brought by Columbus from the Caribbean, and Lisbon, where he saw many goods and marvels from West Africa, as well as a world map. And I've listed some of his Spanish cases here. You don't really need to read them all, but it gives you a sense of it. And here are some of his French examples. He comments often on the shape of the cities below him and their size relative to Nuremberg, and on the beauty of the view and the pleasure it afforded him. Climbing the Tower of Notre Dame in Paris in March 1495, he records for only the second time the number of steps. As we've seen, this was a local habit, perhaps encouraged by a Parisian cicerone, and one which Munzer enthusiastically adopted thereafter. So I've just highlighted in yellow here this description of climbing up the steps. He rates them as 388 rather than the number of days in the year, but you can see that having only once previously in Valencia counted the number of steps, he seems to kind of take up this habit, and from then onwards repeatedly records the number of steps. And what I'd like to suggest with all this is that through this travelogue we kind of witness the emergence of a new and developing architectural habit. Munzer was a learned traveller. He belonged to a dynamic circle of humanist scholars and cartographers in Nuremberg and Portugal, and owned numerous books on geography. Through his friendship with Hartmann Schedel, he was also well acquainted with new developments in cartography and surveying. And he also advised Schedel in preparing the great Liber Chronicarum, published in Nuremberg in 1493, the so-called World Chronicle, with scores of city views from across Europe and the Holy Land. Now, none of these views actually show the city as viewed from a tower. That would be perhaps too neat. But the text accompanying the woodcut of Nuremberg, which I show you here, the largest in the book, explains, quote, that a very old castle located on a hill dominates the city, and from it one has a view of the city and beyond. And again, the word for view there is prospect or prospectus. This is the Chronicle's only reference to the view of a city's prospect from on high, but it may have served as further inspiration for Munzer. So it does seem a kind of striking coincidence that this is with Nuremberg, and I'm going to talk about Nuremberg a lot. It's the one city where they talk about this view. It may have served as further inspiration for Munzer, not least because it was lifted almost verbatim from Leonardo Bruni's description of Verona's castle in De Bello Italico Adversus Gothos of 1441, a text which circulated widely in manuscript and printed form. So it's got a very solid kind of humanist tradition, this idea of surveying the city from a hill or from a castle on the top of it. Yet Munzer's worldview, as I've already hinted at, was not limited to Europe. He penned a history of the Canary Islands, Azores, Madeira, and West Africa, for example. And in July 1493, shortly after publication of Schlegel's Chronicle and of Columbus's first letter from the Americas, and just before embarking on his own travels, Munzer wrote to King John of Portugal, proposing that he send an expedition westwards towards the Indies and Cathay, and recommending as captain his friend Martin Behaim, who, with Munzer's probable assistance, had constructed the first preserved terrestrial globe, which you can see here. Munzer's description of tower climbing in his itinerarium must therefore be understood in this milieu in which Europe's borders were increasingly porous and where empirically derived knowledge was given equal weight to received wisdom. And though I hate to say it, this does seem to me to be rather like a specifically kind of Renaissance phenomenon, with all the Eurocentric caveats that term implies. Munzer frequently notes that a clergy member showed him around the churches he visited, and it's possible that they or other entrepreneurial local guides facilitated access to church towers. Albert Dürer likewise records that when he climbed the tower of Antwerp Cathedral in 1521, he paid 1 stiver and was told that it was higher than that of Strasbourg. When he visited Ghent, it was the local painters who took him up the tower of St. John's. His diaries imply that by the 16th century, climbing such towers had already become a feature of a regular traveller circuit that hitherto focused principally on relics, churches and palaces. This impression is reinforced by other descriptions of tower climbing, by people like Isabella d'Este, and here I give you her description from Venice, 1502. It sounds remarkably modern, like a kind of modern tourist account, and I should say that we can trace the history of climbing the Campanile of San Marco by pilgrims or tourists back to at least 1480. But we find Isabella climbing the tower here in 1502, but we also find other travellers, including Antonio de Beatus, chaplain to a wealthy cardinal who climbed towers in Strasbourg, Ghent and Milan in 1517, 1518, and an anonymous merchant from Milan who travelled in the same years to Paris, Rouen, Amiens, Antwerp, Cordoba and Seville, climbing their towers. Even if other travellers had occasionally climbed towers or high places before him, I'd suggest that Munzer deserves credit for popularising the habit. Probably not through the itinerarium, which survives only in a copy by Schlegel, so his text doesn't have much, there's not much evidence this was widely circulated. But we do know that he was very well networked and connected to a wide range of correspondence. But also, I suggest that those entrepreneurial guides he met along in his travels took this idea and realised that there was an opportunity to get a bit of extra cash from other visitors who might want to enjoy this still eccentric habit. Even this small sample of tower climbing is suggestive, that is to say, these writers who record themselves climbing towers. Munzer and others did not climb a tower in every city they visited, only the most impressive ones. Many of the first generation of tower climbers shared scholarly networks or had connections with Nuremberg or cartography. Munzer, for example, had served as a tutor to Anton Tetzel, nephew of one of Baron Rosmethal's companions, and probably met Dürer in Nuremberg, where the latter may have been involved in the creation of the World Chronicle, the Liber Chronicarum. Antonio de Beatus and Isabella d'Este also knew one another. So this is really quite a small group of people, I think, who we can connect via these, if we like, kind of humanist networks. Towers were also implicated in cartographic endeavours. 2 years before Isabella climbed the Tower of San Marco in Venice, the Nuremberg merchant Anton Kolb published Jacopo de Barbari's extraordinary bird's-eye view of the city, based on surveys of that city from church towers. So Deborah Howard and others have argued that the view of Venice that we have here is notionally one as seen from the tops of San Giorgio Maggiore, but it's been argued by numerous scholars that the way that this extraordinary image must have been created was by people climbing up, or by Yakwudabari climbing up church towers to survey the city. The town hall at Brussels was also used for surveying. It forms the conceptual centre of a diagrammatic map of the city drawn circa 1530 by Gilles van der Hecken, and in 1533 was also used to calculate distances between a number of Flemish cities. In 1530, the Nuremberg printer Nicolas Melderman even published what we might think of as a fish or bird-eye panorama of Vienna during the Ottoman siege, as seen from the cathedral tower. So you can see just on the right a detail there from the centre of this extraordinary print. But the most remarkable product of this vogue for tower climbing, and again this has become a bit of an obsession of mine, is Conrad Morant's engraved panorama of Strasbourg as seen from the top of the cathedral's north tower. This dates to 1546, which by means of a folding flap of parchment represents both the cathedral's facade and its roof as seen from above. So there you can see when the flap is folded down, you get this view onto the cathedral roofs as they would appear if you were on the top of the tower. But then if you fold the flap up, then you get a view of the facade. Was this created with some kind of lens? I wonder. Comparison with the time photo of New York is certainly suggested, though fisheye lenses are generally said to be a creation of the 20th century, whilst the earliest known description of anyone using a camera obscura dates from the 1560s, so sometime after the production of this. Either way, at its completion in 1439, it's about 100 years earlier, Strasbourg's tower rose to 465 feet, making it the tallest structure in Europe. And like the town hall at Brussels, its design encourages climbing. And here I'm just showing you, we're lucky to have numerous drawings that relate to this tower, and they show the very careful thought that was given to the design of the staircases leading up to it. So we've got these four staircases at the lower levels of the tower, which correspond to, this is a detail of a drawing, but to these staircases that you see here. And then running up the spire itself, we have a sequence of stairs that lead up to here and then to the final ascent. So rather like at Prague or at Brussels, the staircases are built into the design. So its design encourages climbing. From the ground, the four staircases of the tower dramatise the ascent, while bust-length sculptures in the spire, visible only to those climbing it, and here we see them, gaze upwards towards its height. In many respects, Strasbourg marks the apogee of a great age of Gothic tower building, but paradoxically, that period had passed by the time Morant made his engraving in 1546. So you can see in the 15th century all these cities competing to build these enormous towers. But by the 1530s, 1540s, Robert Bork has argued that that kind of moment of competitive tower building was over. Cities no longer competed to build the tallest and most magnificent towers, and those already built were increasingly put to novel uses, affording prospects of flourishing cities or opportunities to survey and map territories with new tools and a new level of scientific rigour. It was not only in Europe that visitors climbed towers for the view, however. In August 1520, Dürer was in Brussels, admiring a display of Aztec gifts to the Emperor Charles V. In that same year, Hernan Cortés penned his second letter to Charles, in which he gave, quote, an account of the lands and provinces without number, newly discovered in Yucatan, which he meant what we think of as Mexico. His letter includes a detailed description of Tenochtitlan and its Templo Mayor, which Cortés compared to the Giralda in Seville, counting 50 steps. In his third letter, signed in 1522, Cortes records on several occasions how he climbed the rooftops or torres, by which he means presumably pyramids, in Tenochtitlan to survey his enemies or be seen by them. Quote, "Looking down from that tower," he wrote towards the end of the third letter, "I saw all that we had won of the city, for indeed of 8 parts we had taken 7. Such descriptions emphatically underline the relationship between surveying, surveillance, and structures of power, and echo widely circulated accounts of Christian conquests in medieval Spain, something I've discussed elsewhere. Yet Cortes's relation of lands and provinces also draws on the tradition of travellers' accounts that I've described above, discernible in his enumeration of the number of steps on the Templo Mayor and his comparisons with Seville's Giralda. We saw with Hieronymus Munzer how every city got compared to Nuremberg. The letters were published together in Spanish in Nuremberg. Were published together in Spanish in Seville in 1522, and 2 years later in a Latin translation in Nuremberg, accompanied by this map of Tenochtitlan and the Gulf of Mexico. This is not the place to discuss the contested origins of that famous map, which was supposedly based on one given to Cortes by Moctezuma, but it's relevant here that its panoramic view with the Templo Mayor at the city centre, and I showed you a detail on the right there, has been understood as a fusion of Aztec cartographic traditions with, amongst others, those of tower climbing and map making that, as we have seen, were strongly associated with Nuremberg. So the bits of this that in some ways don't look so different from those maps we've seen coming out of Nuremberg, but Barbamundi and others have shown how particular features seem to have their origins in Aztec visual culture, and this has prompted a kind of widespread debate about the origins of this map. The last of my examples is the porcelain pagoda in the Baoren Monastery in Nanjing, built between 1412 and 1431, a period of heroic Chinese maritime exploration. This glazed octagonal structure, destroyed in the 1850s, rose 9 stories and was embellished with scores of bells and lamps. Already famous in China, it became well known in Europe thanks to Johannes Neuhoff, who visited during the first Dutch trade mission to Qing, China in the 1650s. His account, published in multiple versions, it was very rapidly translated into French and English, for example, was accompanied by several engravings based on his own drawings. We see one of his own drawings there, and one of the engravings based on that in the English edition of 1669. His own account circulated widely, even inspiring Sir William Chambers' design for the pagoda in London's Kew Gardens. And he writes, quote, "In the middle of the plain stands a high steeple or tower made of porcelain, which far exceeds all other workmanship of the Chinese in cost and skill. This tower has 9 rounds and 184 steps to the top. From the upper gallery, you may see not only the whole city, but also over the adjacent countries to the other side of the river Kiang, which is a most delightful prospect, especially if you observe the vast circumference of the city, reaching with her suburb to the riverside." Neuhoff's description is indebted to the European literary conventions that I've already described, but he might not have been able to climb the pagoda were it not already a well-established custom in Nanjing, recorded in poems by Chen Yi and Wang Qizhen, which were themselves collected in illustrated gazetteers, like the examples I show you here. And these poems have never been translated, but Stephen McDowell, one of many China specialists who generously helped me with this section of the paper, tells me that Chen Yi wrote that standing, this is his kind of paraphrase of the poem, that standing just briefly beyond the railings on the top story made Chen Yi made one anxious because it was so high. From there one could see the hills, waterways, towns and people coming and going, and the birds in the clouds below. Wang Qizhen, meanwhile, wrote that, quote, "he badly wanted to climb the tower," unquote, but found it hard to look down already by the 3rd story. From the top, the Yangtze looked like a coiling white dragon in the distance. So we have this earlier poetic record of people climbing the tower, and in fact multiple poems and other sources attest to the antiquity of this practice, which in China was closely associated with climbing mountains, contemplation of the past, and a grand view of the surrounding landscape. The earliest evidence of that habit may be the Rhapsody on Climbing the Tower by Wang Can in the probably early 3rd century, who writes, "I climb this tower and gaze in the 4 directions, briefly stealing some time to dispel my sorrows. I scan the site on which this building rests, truly spacious and open, rare is its pier." And you can find, from this point onward, you can find literally hundreds of poems recording the experience of climbing towers and looking out on the view. And not just in Chinese context either. The diary of the Japanese monk Enin, who in March 841 climbed the Xi'an Pagoda in Chang'an, meanwhile shows that visitors from elsewhere practice their own versions of such habits, and at a much earlier date than their European counterparts. Did the Japanese soldiers on a trade mission who, in October 1614, enjoyed a lavish picnic at the top of Seville's Giralda, understand that experience in relation to long-standing Japanese traditions of climbing Mount Fuji? Not as far as I can find, but doubtless there is more work to be done on visitors to Europe's own savage shores and the habits they brought with them. So I've talked principally about travellers coming out from Europe and going around the world, but following people like Callan Dodds Pencock, it would be interesting to kind of flip that and think about travellers to Europe and elsewhere. So this whistle-stop tour brings me finally to some concluding thoughts. Following principally in the footsteps of European travellers in this paper, I have assuredly sometimes reproduced their imperial gaze. This is, of course, a recognised pitfall of one type of so-called global art history, in which privileged scholars from European or North American centres look enviously across at distant lands, colonising scholarly fields without a linguistic competence to scrutinise them properly, and I'm certainly guilty of that. But in my experience at least, this exercise in comparative but connected histories nonetheless confronts that imperial vision with other traditions and beliefs and demands new kinds of scholarly collaborations. By definition, looking out from a tower places the viewer at the centre of their world and the world they describe. And yet, I like to think that if nothing else, this study exposes a world of multiple and unstable centres. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, for example, was in some ways a symbolic centre of the Eastern Mediterranean kingdom created by Ptolemy I following the partition of Alexander the Great's vast European empire. But for Muqaddisi, who climbed the lighthouse in the late 10th century, it was Cairo, Baghdad, Mecca and Jerusalem that represented the most important religious or political centres of his day, so these centres are shifting. In the late 12th century, Seville's Giralda was built on the northern frontier of an Almohad empire that stretched between Africa and Europe. But when Munza visited in the 1490s, it stood near the southern edge of a Spanish kingdom that was already expanding into the Americas. In 1465, Leo von Rosmetal and his companions visited Brussels because it was the seat of a small but wealthy Burgundian court. 65 years later, when Gilles van der Hecken set the town hall at the centre of his map, Brussels was but one of several powerful cities in a northern province of a Holy Roman Empire that stretched well beyond Europe's traditional borders. The Mexica understood Tenochtitlan as a cosmic and worldly centre, but nor was it by any means peripheral in the European imagine either, and it has been argued that in some respects the 1524 Nuremberg map represents the Aztec capital as a new Jerusalem, and you can't really get more central than that in terms of kind of European identity. Nanjing, literally the southern capital, served as primary capital for the Ming dynasty with a population of over 500,000. But in 1421, while the porcelain tower was still under construction, the imperial capital shifted to Beijing, while the collapse of the Ming dynasty in the 1640s meant that by the 1650s, when Niehoff visited, an old habit had been revived, and Nanjing's monuments served principally as prompts for nostalgic recollection of a glorious history. Studying these monuments together, I hope you will agree, demonstrates the benefits of surveying the past, not from one viewpoint or centre, but from many. Thank you.